Picture this. It's a cold, wet dawn on April the 16th, 1746. You're one of 5,500 men who are lined up on Culloden Moor as part of the Jacobite forces. Your army is led by Charles Edward Stuart, known to his admirers as Bonnie Prince Charlie, who wishes to regain the thrones of Great Britain and Ireland for his family. You're exhausted after walking 20 miles through the night, following orders to launch a surprise attack on the British Army while it slept. The attack never happened. You're about to charge well-fed, well-trained soldiers, loyal to King George II, and led by his son, William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. This is no ordinary battle. The causal lines are blurred. It's a culmination of a civil war pitting families and their supporters against one another. The outcome of this battle will impact not only Scotland, but the rest of Britain, and in time, the whole of the world. How did we get here? Let's find out. To understand the importance of this battle, let's step back 58 years to 1688. It is a tense time in British history. 28 years after the dissolution of Britain's first and only period of republicanism. The roles of the monarch and Parliament are in flux. James VII and II is king of the three kingdoms of Scotland, Ireland, and England. But his days as monarch are numbered. James became king following his brother Charles II's death in 1685. Although a Catholic, James was encouraged to raise his daughters Mary and Anne as Protestants. However, his second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a Catholic son, James Francis. Newborn James instantly replaced his older sisters as successor to the thrones. But key members of the government wanted a Protestant monarch, so, unknown to the king, plans to replace James were put in motion. In November 1688, Dutchman William of Orange, husband of James's eldest daughter Mary, landed in England with the support of many Protestant nobles. James II had gathered an army to repel the invaders, but changed his mind. His father, Charles I, had been executed for coming into conflict with and waging a war against Parliament only 39 years earlier. Fearful for his life, James fled to France with his wife and infant son. With James gone, Parliament seized the opportunity to secure power, changing the law to replace him as king. By early 1689, Mary and William took the thrones together in joint rule. But James had many friends and supporters. They would go on to be known as Jacobites, from the Latin Jacobus, which means James. Ireland had not recognized the change of monarch, and encouraged by the support within the predominantly Catholic Irish and French armies, James landed in Ireland to attempt to regain the thrones in March 1689. This marked the start of a series of risings where James's supporters would attempt to help the Stuart family regain the thrones of the three kingdoms. James's attempt ended in July 1690, following defeat to William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne. Once again, James fled back to France, where he died in 1701. Back on the British Isles, Mary and William ruled the three kingdoms and the overseas territories, but they had no children. And following Mary's death in 1694 and William's in 1702, Anne, Mary's younger sister and herself a Stuart, took the thrones. During this period, Parliament passed two significant bills. Shortly before William died, the Act of Settlement was passed to ensure that only Protestants could inherit the British thrones. And in 1707, the Act of Union was passed, unifying the three kingdoms to form Great Britain and Ireland. By 1714, it was clear Anne's ill health would lead to her imminent demise. With no surviving heirs, the British Parliament needed to find the next ruler of Great Britain and Ireland. In line with the Act of Settlement, they bypassed over 50 legitimate Catholic claimants and endorsed Sophia of Hanover, the great-granddaughter of Mary, Queen of Scots. But Sophia died in her 80s, only months before Queen Anne passed away. So, upon Anne's death in August 1714, the monarchy was passed to Sophia's son, George Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, the first Hanoverian to sit on the British throne. George I was succeeded in 1727 by his son, George II. George II had a large family, including his sons Frederick, Prince of Wales, and William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland. William was his youngest and most favored child, and will feature heavily in the story to come. Meanwhile, in France, James II's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, was sympathetically recognized by the Catholic nations of France and Spain as the rightful heir to the British throne. The Catholic Stuarts had a long-standing alliance with these countries, both of which were currently in open conflict with Britain in the War of the Austrian Succession. While Spain and France recognized James as monarch, the British government considered his claim to the throne treasonous and named him the Old Pretender. Following in his father's footsteps, James Francis made numerous attempts to regain the throne. In the wake of Queen Anne's death and the Tory defeat by the pro-Hanoverian Whig Party in the 1715 general election, James appealed to the Pope to support him in an attempt to regain the throne. Many Tory party nobles were supporters of James II, so began raising armies to defeat the Whigs. Despite it being the largest of the Jacobite risings, this attempt ended after only a few months. A further rising began in 1719, this time using Spanish troops. Some landed in Scotland, but a planned invasion in England failed as the Spanish fleet was badly damaged in a storm. This rising ended in June after defeat at the Battle of Glenshiel. That same year, and while exiled in Rome, James Francis married the Polish princess Maria Klementina Sobieska. They had two sons, Charles Edward, born in 1720, and Henry Benedict, who was born in 1725. Charles Edward would come to be known as the Young Pretender by the government establishment. However, to his Jacobite supporters, he would become known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and represented the hope for the return of the Stuart line to the British throne. With his allies in France and presumed support in Scotland, the young Charles is a key player in the rebellion to come. His struggle to retain the British throne is what will ultimately lead him here, to this battlefield on Culloden Moor. In the cold, dark winter of 1744, 23-year-old Charles Edward Stuart became convinced that now was the time to regain the thrones for his father, and set out to finish what his grandfather had started. So, in the summer of 1745, he set sail for Scotland with two ships. The final Jacobite rising had begun. In July, Charles arrived on the west coast of Scotland with only one ship, following a naval skirmish with British warships. Down on supplies, Charles attempted to gain support for his cause. He believed that the core of Jacobite support was in the Highlands, so he started by gathering the clans in Glenfinnan. Despite only some of the leaders joining him here, many more would join the army throughout Charles's campaign. Charles took Edinburgh without resistance, and his family was established as the true heirs to the Scottish throne. Charles's still living father, James, was named King of Scotland, and Charles became Prince Regent. Charles also made declarations to undo both the Act of Settlement, which had ousted his family from the throne, and the Act of Union. The new Jacobite army won a key victory over the British army at Preston Pans, near Edinburgh, the first significant engagement of the 1745 rising. It then marched southwards, through the Scottish lowlands and into England, gathering new recruits and supplies as it went. Charles would go on to lead an army of English, French, Irish, and Scottish men. This was the beginning of a new civil war. The Jacobites charged southwards undefeated, hoping to capture London and overthrow George II. By December 1745, they arrived in Derby, 125 miles north of London. The leaders became worried. Recruiting men in England proved more difficult than in Scotland, and much of the supplies and men sent from France had been intercepted by the government. The Jacobite leaders knew they risked not being able to feed their troops or protect their gains if they stayed in England. With rumors of a larger British force incoming, Charles was forced, very much against his will, to retreat. It turned out that the Jacobite officers and Council of War were right to be concerned. The government in London had initially reacted slowly to the rising, consistently underestimating what the Jacobite force was capable of. However, in October 1745, the king's son, the Duke of Cumberland, was recalled from Europe to deal with the rising threat. He had been fighting in the War of the Austrian Succession in Flanders, protecting the Austrian Netherlands, now Belgium, from being overrun by the French. Dead set on keeping his father George II on the throne, the Duke of Cumberland wanted to quell the rising as quickly as possible. So, with the Jacobite army heading swiftly back to Scotland, the British army followed in hot pursuit. The Jacobites retreated north through Carlisle, leaving around 400 men, including the Manchester Regiment, which consisted mostly of English Jacobites, to hold the city and guard their journey north. But that winter, Carlisle was soon recaptured by British forces. The main Jacobite army attempted to extend their control over the Scottish lowlands, winning a battle at Falkirk and besieging Stirling Castle. This would have allowed the Jacobites greater control between the Highlands and Lowlands. However, the Jacobite army was ill-equipped for a siege, and on hearing that Cumberland's army was marching north from Edinburgh, the Jacobites retreated to Inverness. Meanwhile, the Duke of Cumberland took his men east to Aberdeen, where they encamped and trained for a coming battle. When they finally faced the Jacobites, they were going to be ready. By the spring of 1746, the Duke was ready to engage again. The Jacobites were short on both food and money. So when British forces left Aberdeen in April, the Jacobite leadership decided to face them in battle. On April the 14th, the British army reached Nairn, about 10 miles northeast of here. The Jacobites expected battle the following day and waited on Culloden Moor for the British army to arrive. However, it was the Duke's birthday the next day, so the British army stayed at camp to celebrate with extra rations. The Jacobites decided to march their army through the night to attack the British soldiers while they slept. This was an unmitigated disaster. The Jacobites traveled cross-country in order to avoid detection. As they marched through the sleeting night, the line of soldiers stretched out in the dark, with many men losing their way. By the time the depleted army got close enough to attack the sleeping British troops, their numbers were so low that it would have been futile to engage. The Jacobites had no choice. They could not attack. Instead, they marched another 10 miles back to camp near Culloden House. They returned to camp exhausted, where some men fell down asleep where they stood. After only a few hours of rest, the Jacobites found themselves back on Culloden Moor, facing a well-rested and well-fed British army. The Jacobites could be an incredibly formidable opponent on the battlefield. Perhaps their most well-known tactic was the Highland Charge, a highly effective battle technique designed to shock their opponents and break through enemy lines. When the opposing armies met on the battlefield, the Jacobites would begin their attack by shouting and screaming and bashing their swords and shields in order to instill fear in the enemy and break down morale. The Jacobites would then charge as one. Speed was critical to the success of the charge, so tactical decisions were made to ensure the men could run quickly. Firm ground with a downward slope was selected. The soldiers were relatively lightly armed, carrying 3 main weapons: a one-handed broadsword, a type of small shield called a targe, and a dirk, which was a long knife or dagger. However, by Culloden, many Jacobite soldiers also carried muskets and bayonets. Though opponents were using artillery at this point of the battle, the Jacobites would avoid taking enemy fire while charging by dropping to the ground when they saw the enemy was about to attack. The speed of the charge meant opponents often didn't have time to reload more than once before the Jacobites were upon them. In melee fighting, Jacobite soldiers would deflect bayonet blows with their targes and then use their broadsword or dirk to attack. This allowed them to quickly break through enemy lines. Before the battle, the bard called out the names of fallen heroes, which the warriors repeated back, roused to a frenzy before the call of Claymore, being the signal to charge. We are now standing in the middle of the moor. It's midday on April the 16th, 1746. The two armies are facing each other. On one side stands the Jacobite army, made up of at least 5,000 men, Highland clansmen and Lowland Scots, as well as volunteers from England and the French and Irish regiments sent from France, the Royal Écossais and the Irish Piquets, respectively. Opposing them are the British troops, some 9,000 men, led by William Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland. The conditions are far from ideal for the Jacobites. They are outmanned, outgunned, and underprepared. Not only are they tired after marching through the night on the aborted sneak attack, the officers also haven't had time to choose the most advantageous location. They're a kilometer from the area of high ground where they had intended to give battle. The location they've ended up on is boggy and wet, terrain unsuitable for the Highland charge. The battle begins with cannon fire from the Jacobites. Flying over the heads of the British troops, the British army retaliates. But the Jacobites don't have the ammunition for a prolonged artillery exchange, and their guns quickly fall silent. The highly trained, better-equipped British forces continue to fire, wreaking havoc on the Jacobite line. Charles wants the Duke of Cumberland to make the first move, so does not give the order to charge. The minutes that the Jacobites stand under a barrage of cannon fire must feel like an eternity. While the casualties are minimal, the effect on morale from withstanding this attack is huge. Meanwhile, on the British side, government troops are sent to break down walls on the Jacobites' left side, allowing mounted dragoons to attack them from behind. Part of the Jacobite second line turns to fend off this attack, but it is clear the time for the charge is now or never. Finally, the order comes, and the men begin to run across the moor, screaming war cries. The ever-effective Highland charge begins. While previous armies fell with ease to the ferocious Highland charge, the Duke of Cumberland's troops know the tactic the Jacobites will use, and have been preparing themselves to face it all winter while in Aberdeen. A charge is fast, so the British army needs to be fast too. They've been practicing new drills and are able to reload their muskets incredibly quickly, up to 3 times a minute, maximizing the amount of shots they can fire before the Jacobites are upon them. As the Jacobites charge across the field, they are hindered by the poor terrain. A large patch of bog on the Jacobite left forces the centre regiments to converge with the right. The left flank, MacDonald regiments, continue laboriously through the bog. The Jacobites are under continual musket and cannon fire. With the approaching Jacobites concentrating on the right side, the British forces switch to using grape shot, which are bags of musket balls loaded into the cannon. This effectively turns the cannon into a huge shotgun, capable of taking out large swathes of Jacobites at once. The charging Jacobites reach the government's left side. The brunt of the attack is borne by just 2 British regiments, Barrel's 4th Foot and Dijon's 37th Foot. Despite sustaining heavy losses, the Jacobite right flank still manages to break through the first British line. However, at this point, the Duke orders 2 regiments from the second line to attack the Jacobite flanks. Another 2 engage them from the front. The Jacobites are now surrounded on 3 sides, and the Duke orders his men to open fire. In just a few minutes, 700 men are killed or wounded. Less than an hour after the battle began, the Jacobites have lost. Charles orders his forces to retreat. The Duke of Cumberland wants to ensure the Jacobite cause is permanently crushed and orders his men to act without mercy. The pursuing British army is ruthless, killing any injured Jacobite soldier left on the battlefield, and cutting down both retreating soldiers and fleeing civilians alike. Casualties for the British army total about 50 dead and 250 wounded. However, the Jacobites lose up to 1,500 men, with many more injured. Charles flees. He sends a letter to his men telling them to seek safety the best they can. Despite the offer of a huge reward for his capture, Charles is aided by many of his supporters. He takes refuge in the Outer Hebrides, but he evades capture for several months. Finally, he is helped to Skye by a 24-year-old woman called Flora MacDonald. Disguised as Flora's Irish maid, Betty Burke, Charles boards a ship to France on the 20th of September 1746, never to return. 2 weeks later, the boatmen were detained and confessed. Flora was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Fortunately, she was later released under general amnesty in June 1747. Despite lasting less than 60 minutes, the Battle of Culloden was a seminal point in history. Not only was it the last pitched battle to happen on British soil, It also marked the last of the Jacobite risings and any viable martial attempt for the Stuarts to retake the British throne. Centuries later, Parliament still has supremacy over the crown, and our current monarchs, the Windsors, are the direct descendants of the Hanoverians. Such is the significance of this battle that in the following decades, Culloden became a site of pilgrimage. Yet no formal memorial was built here until 135 years after the battle took place. This is that memorial cairn, erected in 1881 by the last laird resident at Culloden House. The man who had the cairn and the clan stones erected, Duncan Forbes, was a direct descendant of Duncan Forbes of Culloden, a Scottish lawyer who played a major role in suppressing the Jacobite rising in 1745. After the battle, British forces secured the field whilst the bodies of the fallen were stripped and looted. Only on the third day after the battle were people from the town of Inverness rounded up to bury the dead. The people who died here were diverse. The oldest Jacobite was in his mid-70s. The youngest in both armies were boys of around 13 years old. Women who travelled with the Jacobite army were also caught up in the aftermath. All in all, there are believed to be around 1,500 who died in battle buried in this area, Jacobites and British soldiers alike. Identifying bodies would have been difficult. Clansmen would often wear small identifiers like pins or sprigs of their clan plant, but there were no clan tartans at this time. Burying clans and regiments together might not have been possible. The grave markers at Culloden are thought to be symbolic rather than the accurate location of the clan graves. These markers are the traditional burying places of the clan. They commemorate the following: Fraser, Campbell, Mackintosh, Clandonald, Keppoch, MacLean, McLaughlin, Athol Highlanders, McGilvray, Stuarts of Appin. The stones, of course, do not represent everyone who fought here. We know that the Camerons, Farquharsons, MacLeans, MacLeods, Chisholms, and MacDonalds of Clanranald and Glengarry all had constituents on the field. Some on both sides. Each year on the Saturday closest to the 16th of April, people from across the world gather here to remember those who lost their lives in this battle and to learn about the Jacobites. The bloodshed didn't end on the battlefield. To the Duke of Cumberland, the Jacobites were traitors to the crown and should be treated as such. He ordered his men to hunt down any person thought to be a rebel and treat them with no mercy. Many settlements were destroyed and livestock confiscated. Over 100 Jacobites were hanged. The repercussions went far beyond the Jacobite army. For example, many Jacobite women were imprisoned and sent to London for trial. Despite not being soldiers, they helped the Jacobite cause by offering soldiers money and hospitality, spying on the British forces, tending to the wounded, and hiding fugitives from Cumberland's forces. The Duke justified the atrocities by labeling the Jacobite traitors. He believed it was his duty to prevent any further risings and rarely offered any form of clemency. However, soldiers under foreign employ, the French regiments of the Royal Écossaise and the Irish Piquets, were able to surrender and did not suffer the same reprisals as the rest of the British-born Jacobite army. When news of the British victory reached London, the Duke of Cumberland was hailed as a hero for bringing about the end of the Jacobite rebellion. He was nicknamed Sweet William by his supporters, and Handel composed a song in his honor, "See the Conquering Hero Comes." However, news of his cruel, brutal treatment of the Highlanders became well known, and his opponents gave him another name, the Butcher. He went on to fight wars in Europe, but he never saw the same military success. After a failed operation in Hanover, the Duke of Cumberland resigned all his military and public offices. He spent his final years advising his nephew, King George III, and died in London, aged 44. This stone was put up at the same time as the memorial cairn. It marks the traditional burial place of the British soldiers. The stone itself reads, "Field of the English. They were buried here." This is not entirely accurate. While the British forces certainly contained many English soldiers, this was in part a civil war, and there were Scottish and English soldiers on both sides of the battle. Scottish clans were not universally in support of Charles. In fact, many clans were divided over the rising. For example, there were Macintoshes fighting on both sides of the field. After the battle, life became very difficult in the Highlands. The government based in London put new laws in place, designed to crush the last remnants of Jacobitism. These laws included the 1746 Act of Proscription, which banned Scots from carrying weapons, and the 1746 Dress Act, which banned men and boys from wearing Highland dress like kilts. These acts were rigorously enforced, and the punishments severe: heavy fines or 6-month prison sentences. Repeated offences would lead to forced conscription or transportation to the colonies. The Dress Act effectively ended the everyday use of Highland dress during the 40 years it was in force. The government also passed the Heritable Jurisdictions Act, 1746, which abolished the judicial and military rights of the clan chiefs. This applied to all clans, even the ones who had fought alongside the British Army during the 1745 Rising. Landowners who had supported Charles were captured and their land forfeited. This money was used to make vast agricultural and urban improvements in Scotland. In 2006, the University of Glasgow excavated across the field to gain a better understanding of what happened on that day. They found musket balls, buckles, and buttons torn from clothing in the heat of battle. One of the most fascinating objects is a small pewter cross found near here. It's in the style of stone crosses found on the west coast of Scotland. Perhaps this was a talisman used by one of the soldiers on the battlefield. We will never know who it belonged to, but it is a poignant reminder of the hundreds of lives that were lost in this final bloody battle of the Jacobite Rising. In the years following Culloden, the British Army, heavily embroiled in conflicts overseas, began recruiting unemployed Highland men in large numbers. This further suppressed the Highlanders from being able to rebel again, because so many of their men were occupied in other wars. Joining the army meant these men could continue the military traditions of the clans in some form, as they were permitted to wear Highland dress and carry weapons only when serving in the military. We are now at Leonach Cottage. This small cottage would have most likely been constructed at the beginning of the 18th century. During the Battle of Culloden, it served as a field hospital for the British troops, and it's probably one of the only buildings which were used in the battle to still be standing today. Despite falling to ruin in the late 1880s, it has been repaired and maintained over the years to memorialize the battle. Today, the landscape of the battlefield is still relatively intact. Its large, open spaces evoke powerful feelings of that fateful day of 1746. Thank you for joining us on this virtual visit of Culloden Moor today. The National Trust for Scotland's Voice is vitally important in protecting Scotland's heritage. Together, the places and objects in our care tell the stories of Scotland and the Scots, often with wide-ranging effects. Without our involvement, many of these places and artifacts of Scottish heritage would have been lost forever to the damage caused by time, tide, climate, and development. As a conservation charity, we need your help to protect Scotland's heritage. By joining or donating to the National Trust for Scotland, you will help us preserve the story of Culloden for future generations.